what do you think about this? Do you think that's fair, not fair, that someone can win more votes but lose the election? Yeah.
I mean, I think it's very complicated, and I mean, I don't really think it's the most fair, but it's a system for a reason, so.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into, it is a complicated system, that's what we're gonna get into today, because it is very difficult to understand. A lot of people, most people, just in general, don't understand how it works. So it is complicated. Does anyone else want to share their thoughts about this? Yeah?
I agree with what Matt said, because it's put in place for a reason, obviously, but like, I don't think it's fair that the most popular vote doesn't get to be in place.
Yeah, of course. Any other last thoughts before we get into this? Okay. So, just a little bit about the history and origins of the Electoral College. You guys, I think, already touched on this a little bit when in one of our previous classes, where Article 2 of the Constitution does, that's what sort of establishes the Electoral College in the U.S. And I believe that was something that we briefly talked about when we were talking about how the Constitution set up other parts of U.S. government and elections, like age requirements for certain offices. The Electoral College is one of those things that the Constitution lays out. And the original intention was that it would be a sort of balance of power between different states in the U.S., different regions and groups of people in the U.S., because you have smaller states like Rhode Island that wanted to have more say, and this system does allow that, while also preserving the fact that larger states do still have a greater say. So a lot of this really was sort of born out of compromise. So now we'll actually get into how the Electoral College works, and it's a little bit complicated and involves a little bit of math, but not a lot. So each state has a set number of electors, and electors pretty much are just people who represent the state and make the vote official. But basically an elector and an electoral vote are going to be the same thing for today. So the number of electors or electoral votes that a state has is equal to the number of congressmen that they have serving in the federal Congress, and then 2 senators that they have in Congress as well. So New Jersey, for example, has 14 electoral votes. That means that they have 12 representatives, right? Because 12 representatives plus our 2 senators equals our 14 electoral votes. That's how we get to that number. Then candidates have to win individual races through a winner-takes-all race. And what a winner-takes-all race is when it doesn't matter how the vote breaks down. It only matters who wins the most. So in each state you have these races run, where you could have one candidate winning 48% and the other 52%. Let's say this race takes place in New Jersey, which has 14 electoral votes. It wouldn't be split 8 and 6 votes proportionally. It would be the candidate that wins 52% would win all 14 votes. So that's sort of how the system works. And if you add up all the electoral votes that every state has, you equal 538 total votes, which means a candidate has to win 270 in order to win. And that's the only requirement. There's no requirement in the Constitution that references popular vote. It's only the fact that you need a majority of the electoral votes. So the number you need to win is 270, and that's it. There are, of course, some problems that people have raised throughout time, but a lot of these are particularly relevant now. A lot of people are talking about this stuff. So swing states in particular are controversial, and they are a byproduct of the Electoral College system. Does anyone know of has anyone heard of swing states before? some people have, some people haven't. Does anyone who has heard of them know of any in particular? Because there's a couple big ones that people always talk about, yeah?
Is Texas one?
Texas is actually becoming one. So historically it hasn't been, but that's interesting because in the 2020 election it was considered almost a swing state. So, but Florida and Ohio are other really big ones. North Carolina too, Arizona, those are some other states that are typically considered swing states because they're large enough to make a difference in the Electoral College. But they also don't have the strong sort of, we call a partisan lean, that's basically just how competitive a state is. So a state like California isn't competitive at all. It's very, very Democratic. Likewise, a state like Alabama is very Republican. So neither one of these states really can be considered a swing state because the margin of victory is not close enough to allow it to be competitive. And some people say that that's bad because often these states will get ignored. And even though actually in the 2020 election, California had the most Republican votes of any state, because it's such a large state, that only equated to like 30% of California. But basically all those votes got ignored. And then there's a question of fair representation. How well does this whole system actually represent the individual voters? Because it does over-represent smaller states because you have the congressional divide, and all of that, is more or less proportional to the population. However, the addition of those two Senate, the two votes that are equal to the senators, skew this. And while it might sound like only two votes, that's not that significant. When you break it down, actually do the math, it's quite shocking, actually. So a state like Wyoming, which has 3 electoral votes, actually that comes out to less than 200,000 people per vote. Whereas California has 730,000 people per vote. And New Jersey is a pretty large state, so we have 636 people per electoral vote. That's kind of, what do you guys think of that? Do you think that's, because the word fair is subjective, so do you guys see that as fair or not fair? That your vote means, that your individual vote in New Jersey when you turn 18 is less important than it would be in Wyoming? Do you feel as though, is that how you feel, or do you see it a different way? Anyone want to share their thoughts? Is anyone a little bit confused and want me to go over anything? Because this is a lot, this is very complicated. Yeah?
So basically, based on the population, like of the state, so like for New Jersey, obviously it's a lot of people for each electoral vote. So like, if you went to like a state that has a very small population, would your vote count as more? Kind of?
Yeah, pretty much, because if you move from New Jersey to Wyoming, you're now in a pool of only 200,000 people per electoral vote. So your vote can matter more, could swing an election more in a state like Wyoming because there's just less people in the race. And so that's sort of the logic behind this argument. But there's other arguments as to why people consider fairness based on different factors, and representation is just one of those factors when people are determining the fairness of the Electoral College. The last one, and the one that we're going to sort of be getting into today in our activity, is about the popular vote. Because the electoral vote does not always, for a while, and for most of US history, it did correlate with the Electoral College. However, there have been a couple times where it hasn't, and particularly twice in the last 22 years.